All right, this week is week 6, Council, Saints, and Icons. Before we get into it a little bit, you will notice that I have given you bolded the names if you want to look things up online, the Second Council of Constantinople or the Council of Ephesus or whatever. Don't use those. I'm just going to say it now. It's just confusing to try and remember which city was the one that had the council that talked about the whatever thing. And in fact, if you look at the feasts in the life of the church, we commemorate the fathers of the First Ecumenical Council, not the fathers of the First Council of Nicaea. I mean, technically speaking, either are valid, but when people talk about that feast, they talk about the feast of the fathers of the First Ecumenical Council. They don't bother to say the city name most of the time anyway. So I have given you those names here. I'm just going to refer to them as 1 through 7. Substantially easier to figure out which one I'm talking about if I just give you a number. And the numbers are also there, so hopefully it's easy enough to follow along. The other quick note, which I find myself saying a lot with these classes, but obviously I could probably teach an entire class on any one of these councils, and I'm trying to talk about 7 and other theologies and everything else. So understand that I will do my best to give you at least a basic introduction about the things that were covered at each of these, and if you have a particular question, feel free to ask, and we can certainly talk about that element more. But these were sometimes multi-year councils where people got together many times, so there's no possible way we could cover everything in all of them. The other thing that I want to talk about a little bit before we dig into them, which I don't think I really put in here much because it's just not the way we do it. You may have heard of canon law, and outside of Orthodoxy, canon lawyers. Those are usually referencing the output of these councils. The reason that we don't tend to use that language very much, and we tend to talk more about just what was talked about at the council instead of the specific output, is that those rules, though important, are not, in the Orthodox world anyway, the end-all, be-all. They are not a law in the way that they're treated outside the Orthodox Church anyway. Meaning, in a sense, it doesn't make sense to have a lawyer, because a lawyer's job is to apply law, which is not what these are. You may recall from last week, we talked about the role of the bishop in the diocese. Is there anyone above a bishop in his diocese? No. So if the bishop says that they're doing something and it's against a canon, are we doing it? Yes. Why is that? Because the bishop's job is to figure out the best way of managing his diocese that will be spiritually beneficial for everyone. And so, for example, a very common canon from one of these councils that is bent quite a bit these days is the age for ordination. There are ages that you are supposed to be ordained to each of the particular ranks, and it is pretty common to bend those by usually not a substantial amount. You read about some saints that were ordained to the priesthood at the age of like 18 or 19. Clearly a bishop gave his blessing for that, but that's certainly not the norm. More common is by maybe a year or two, right? You're supposed to be ordained to the priesthood at 30, so a priest being ordained at 28 or 29 is not that weird. Even though technically the canon says 30, especially in North America here, where we have a big need for lots of priests to fill the holes in all of our parishes that we keep making more of, you're probably going to prioritize someone who is around 30 rather than being absolutely strict to this law, because again, for the health of the parish, for the health of the diocese, it's better to have someone there. And so that is how a lot of these are handled. Some of these councils also, for example, prescribe means by which those outside the church are to be received back into the church, whether we baptize or chrismate, for example. And ultimately speaking, that decision today comes down to the bishop to decide if this group or that group, are they received always by baptism, or do we accept their baptism and chrismate? So we're going to talk about a lot of things from here, but I'm not going to tell you a list of the canons that came out of each of them, because it's just not helpful, it's not useful, and it's not the way the church treats them. The canons are helpful, they are guides, they're a good standard that we usually try to follow. But for many reasons, it frequently comes down to what the bishop decides is most effective and most necessary in his parish, in his diocese, even if there's theoretically a canon that says that it shouldn't happen that way. Okay. So, the First Council of Nicaea, or like I said before, the First Ecumenical Council, was in 325. This is the iconic one with Arius, who was a priest, who, in short, taught that Jesus Christ was a created being. He was the first and most preeminent among all the created beings, but nevertheless still just a created being and therefore not God. If you follow Arianism down through the subsequent decades and whatever, through time, it shifts a little bit, as is the case with many of these heresies. What is initially discussed is sometimes discussed again later, so you'll see me mention Arianism, like, for example, in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, it condemns Arianism again, right? And that's 200-ish years later, right? So even though the council met to discuss Arianism and ultimately condemned it, it took quite a while for the heresy to actually go away. This is where the Nicene Creed was first written. I give you the text of the revised version, which comes out of the Second Ecumenical Council, which is what we say today in our services. There was a little bit of added language to strengthen the Trinity, but you can go look up the original version of the Nicene Creed from the First Ecumenical Council. It's a little different, but not too bad. If you're familiar with St. Nicholas, jolly old St. Nicholas, and the story of him slapping a dude, that was this council, that was Arius, for calling Christ not divine and just a created being. I also want to call out, because I think it's important, although I said I wasn't going to talk about canons, I will very briefly mention, I don't remember if it's this or the next council, but one of them describes how to receive Arians into the faith, and it says that Arians are to be received by, what do you think, baptism or chrismation? Chrismation. Which I hope stands out, because Arianism is called the arch heresy, and Arius the arch heretic. So we clearly have a big problem with Arianism, and yet we still receive those coming from Arianism by chrismation, which I would posit, and certainly the bishops here in North America agree, would mean that it's reasonable to conclude that there are some Protestant backgrounds today that can and probably should be received by chrismation, even if there are others that should be received by baptism. But clearly, if an Arian baptism is considered valid enough that we can just do chrismation, surely that can be applied today as well in some way, shape, or form. All right. The Second Ecumenical Council was not that long after the first. Oh, sorry, one more thing I wanted to say about the first. Sometimes it is levied against the church that this first council was something that Constantine the Great basically coerced the church into doing, and that he sort of rewrote the course of the church by kind of bullying the church in this ecumenical council. There's a few problems with that. For example, the creed that came out of this council that we just talked about a minute ago was not composed, at least entirely, in this council. It was taken from a creed that was already in use in other churches, in the church at that time, and was just modified to address Arianism and some other things that were brought up as concerns at that time. So this was not something that, Constantine dictated and then became the way the church went. It was taking what the church was already doing that was good and confirming it, and taking what was bad in Arius and denying it. So nothing then that comes out of this council is truly new, except how to then go forward. What do we do now that we have said that Arianism is bad? What do we do with those that are Arians that want to come back into the church? How do we handle that? That, of course, has to be new. But everything about the, again, the creed as the kind of prime example there, and many of the other things I talked about, are all drawing from the history of the church, not being generated in the council. And so, though Constantine is credited with, shall we say, coercing the bishops to get together, demanding that they deal with this heresy that was threatening the stability, the peace of the empire, what he did not do as head of a state was get too involved. And if you don't believe the history that I just put forward, I want you to imagine, practically speaking, how a head of state would have time to sit in several years' worth of meetings to discuss these things and still be a good head of state. I would argue there's no possible way that that makes any sense, right? Certainly, it is entirely possible that he we know he was at least in some way involved. He didn't just kick him off and then leave, right? He at least was given some, position of honor within the council. But he certainly could not be micromanaging everything that came out of this council because it was long. There were many sessions. There were hundreds of bishops present. It just wouldn't have been possible practically for that to happen. All right, yes?
What does the word ecumenical actually mean?
From the whole body. Yeah. So an ecumenical council is considered ecumenical when it is representative of the entire church. So it was not just Constantinople that was present. There were at least legates and delegates from all over, from Rome, from Antioch, from Jerusalem, from Constantinople. So you can look, you can find the list of all the bishops that signed. I'm not going to say a number right now because I'm probably misremembering from one of the other councils, but hundreds of bishops from all over. And just because there is a bishop, remember that there's also all of their other delegates under them. So a massive event. All right. Second ecumenical council then was not that long later. And as I alluded to before, the revision of the Nicene Creed, which is sometimes called the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, which is on the back. You probably don't need that if you've been to a service ever, because we sing this every Sunday. So this is what we just call the Creed. We don't use another one. It's this one. That's it. And the biggest reason for the revision was because Arianism did not go away, and in fact became an even larger problem. And so the council was called again, and yet again confirmed what the last council had said, which is, no, Arianism is actually very bad, please stop, and strengthened some of the language within the creed to make it more clearly anti-Arianism. So if you look, for example, it says, and I believe one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten of the Father, before all ages, light of light, true God, begot, not made, of one essence with the Father, by whom all things were made. Right? There is no way that you can read that and you can say that and believe that Jesus is not God. I just don't, that's just not possible. So they added a lot more to try and strengthen the Trinitarian nature and specifically some of the language around Jesus.
Was this where was Holy Spirit language also present in the original, or was that also added?
No, they didn't wildly change anything about the creed. If you read through the two, they're very clearly the same thing. They've just added some language in a few places to make it a little stronger. But you're welcome to go look. Like I said, both are easily found online, so feel free to take a look on your own time if you're interested. For the purposes of continuing with time, keeping with the allotted time today, I'm going to move on to the Third Ecumenical Council. because this is when we start seeing a new heresy come up, which was Nestorianism. Nestorianism, I think I gave you some of the definitions on the back, so if you are curious, you can look. I gave you some in the minute, but in the front, but slightly more in the back. So Nestorianism, like Arianism, also changed quite a bit with time. But to kind of summarize it from a kind of high level for the purposes of this discussion, there was one big thing that Nestorius really could not agree with, and that was that God would be born as a baby and do all of the things that a baby does. He could not believe that God would allow himself to be so humiliated as to be an infant. And so he refused to use the word we use for the Mother of God, which is Theotokos, God-bearer, and instead wanted to use the term Christotokos, Christ-bearer. And in doing so, tried to make a weird distinction between Christ the man, Jesus the man, and the second person of the Trinity. Although he did not deny that Jesus was divine, at least in some way, shape, or form, he really liked, there's a, in Luke it goes through and it describes Jesus' birth narrative, and then there's a line that says he grew in wisdom and understanding. Nestorius really latched onto that and said, so that means that at some point in time he realized his divinity. Or in later forms of Nestorianism, at some point his divinity was thrust on him and he became God and man. Out of Nestorianism comes several even more bizarre heresies down the line, which were still condemned. Things like saying that Christ the man, Jesus the man, was walking. He was the one that cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Completely misunderstanding that that's just quoting a psalm. And that Christ the angel came upon Jesus the man and puppeted him or something. I don't know. There's a bunch of weird versions of this. But suffice it to say, for now at least, that Nestorianism kind of opened the door for many branching heresies down the road that had this understanding that, again, God is not able, it is not right or proper for God to become fully human. And so there must be some way to define Jesus as both God and man without actually him being fully God and man. Which may be a little confusing, but I don't know what to tell you. We're very used to our form of Christianity today, so I'll do my best. But I put on the back, Jesus and the Son of God were different beings united into one, right? So we don't have any understanding of Jesus being in any way split in his identity, right? He's not like, Jesus one moment and Christ or the Son of God the second moment, right? He is fully and completely both simultaneously in our understanding. Okay. Nestorianism, as some of these others, would go on for quite some time in various forms, but not before the Council of Chalcedon. The Fourth Ecumenical Council is called, again, just a few years later, because, again, kind of out of Nestorianism came something similar, which is monophysitism, which effectively tried to delineate the two natures of Christ, his human and divine, basically the mono, saying that he had one nature that was both human, an intermingling of human and divine. And you actually, if you pay attention to some of the hymnography in the church, you may notice that it is not uncommon for the choir to sing about Christ being without confusion or without mingling or something along those lines, God and man. And it's because of monophysitism that we use that language even to this day. Because our understanding is that Jesus Christ has two full and complete natures. He is fully God and fully man, and that those do not combine. And the reason for this is very simple, and it's very similar reason that we would go back to Arianism and also say that it does not work. In order for, at least this is our understanding, in order for Jesus' work to be salvific for us, he must be God. God and only God can save. So therefore Arianism on its face is out, right? You're saying that Jesus is not God, so, okay, that doesn't work. But the other side of it is that, at least our understanding is that he is combining he's making a path for our humanity to enter into the kingdom. He is taking our human nature and fixing it and making it divine, such that we can achieve salvation. So, what that means for us is that if Jesus, in fact, had only one nature, which was a mingled human and divine, then all of his work, his death and resurrection, ascension into heaven, paving a path for us, was only a path paved for those with a single mixed human and divine nature. And how many people have that nature? In this example, it would be him and only him, which would mean his saving work was for only him, and the rest of us get left behind. And so that is why it is very important for us then that we say that Jesus had a full and distinct human nature, so that we can do the things that he did, so that we can die and resurrect and ascend just like he did. Yes?
So then, what exactly is the difference between the monophysitism that is condemned and what, like, the meophysites is?
We'll talk about that in a minute. So what you are talking about is a modern term. So you'll note I don't put anything on here about meophysitism. That is the word used today for those that reject the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, and are therefore called non-Chalcedonian. Their claim is that they don't mean what I just said. They only kind of mean it. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I don't know that it's really that necessary for the purposes of this discussion, but suffice to say that the non-Chalcedonian churches today that are in dialogue with the rest of the Orthodox world will basically say that we're saying the same thing, we're just using different words. And our problem with that is, if that's the case, then why couldn't that have been figured out at the council when hundreds of very smart people sat together for quite some time to discuss these things? You would have thought if they were actually saying the same thing, just using different words at some point, someone would have gone, hey, wait a minute, we're actually saying the same thing. And yet, they didn't. So those that today fall that are non-Chalcedonian will try and claim that us calling them monophysites is incorrect, and that they are actually meophysites, and that is better and different and better. But again, our perspective continues to be, if that's the case, then why has there never been the ability for us to just say the same thing? Words do matter, so we need to be able to say the same thing. And if we can't say the same thing, then we're not saying the same thing. So, does that answer that question at least enough for now?
Yeah, for now, yeah.
All right. Yeah, no, okay. So, though there were some churches that split at the Third Ecumenical Council, to my knowledge, the only one you'll really see today is the Assyrian Church of the East, which is sometimes called the Nestorian Church of the East. I'm not sure. I don't think there are any others, at least major players on the board left, that reject the Council of Ephesus, the Third Ecumenical Council. There are quite a few, though, that continue to this day to reject the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Those are the Copts out of Egypt, the Ethiopians out of Ethiopia, and at least of the major groups that are not allied with anyone else, the Malankara Orthodox Church in India. Although theirs is a little more complicated, they effectively just got shut off from the rest of the world and kind of kept doing their own thing. So it's not quite as clear as, for example, the Coptic Church, that very definitively rejected the Fourth Ecumenical Council. The other thing to understand about the Fourth Ecumenical Council was that, at the time anyway, the reason that it was rejected is because their claim was that our understanding, saying that he has two complete and distinct natures, human and divine, is Nestorianism. Their claim was that actually our faith is Nestorianism, that we have not done enough to distinguish the separateness of... Nestorianism had this idea, again, that the human and the divine were very separated. And so they look at what we said and say, no, that's not good enough, you're just the same thing, but using different words. Of course, I hope it's clear from what we've said that we do not believe in Nestorianism in any way, shape, or form. And for the reasons that I described before, we can't also agree that Christ's nature is mixed, because again, if it is, then he and only he is saved, and the rest of us are out of luck. All right, questions about all that?
Question from online is, does theosis mean salvation implies that we will merge with the Holy Trinity?
Nope. Yeah, theosis becoming... merging with the Trinity is some form of Origenism, I think. I believe Origenism had some understanding of effectively like pieces of the divine becoming humans, and then we do our own thing, and if we do good enough, we can merge again. No. Theosis is an understanding that we can become like God. That we can become holy like he is, that we can put on Christ, as we say in some of our services through the year. And therefore, we're made in his image and likeness. We can be like him, but we cannot be God. Or I guess another modern form, I believe, is Mormonism, I think, has some understanding of becoming divine. Remember in all of this, whenever I talk about an Orthodox group, that I've never been anything other than Orthodox, so forgive me if I'm mistaken, but that's my understanding anyway. Theosis is becoming, sometimes we'll say little g gods rather than capital G gods. Does that make sense? Good. All right, any other questions about the Fourth Ecumenical Council? All right. On to the Fifth Ecumenical Council. As was done in all of them, it reaffirmed everything from the previous councils. One of the reasons I call it out here is because of the split with the Fourth Ecumenical Council, because there was such division in the church about the decisions of the Fourth Ecumenical Council. One of the things the Fifth made a very explicit point of doing was say that all of the previous ones, including the Fourth, were legitimate. It condemned some new forms of Arianism, Nestorianism, and monophysitism. Like I said before, remember, these did not just go away just because the council told them to. Arianism kind of ebbed and flowed, but remained around for quite some time. Arguably, there are churches today that are Arian, although I don't know that they would use that term. And it's a pretty common form to hear people, especially those that are of the, it's kind of like spiritual but not religious type of person who's like, well, I don't know about the whole Jesus is God thing, but he certainly was a cool dude that had some good things to say. I don't know that they would identify themselves as being Arianism, but that is what that effectively is. So even though there isn't maybe a continuous line of groups that are Arianism through to this day, certainly the general idea has not completely gone away really ever.
The JWs.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. The Sixth Ecumenical Council, again, more against the monothelitism. So monophysitism before about the two natures. This one, monothelitism, affirmed that Christ had both a human and divine will. Monothelitism implying he has only one will, which is a mix of the two. And again, our understanding is if he has two complete and distinct natures, that there must be a will to go along with that. And the prime example that we point to for that is in the garden when he's sweating blood before the crucifixion. The human side of all of us does not want to die. And the human side of Jesus was also not thrilled at the idea of dying, even though the divine certainly understood that this was necessary, and his human side also understood, but there's a very innate gut reaction of preserving our own life, right? It's not something you need to teach someone. In fact, you need to teach people out of it. It is something shared by all people. We want to preserve our own life. So this voluntary passion, as we say all the time in our services, required him to overcome that in his human will, which was never going to be pleased by that. And so, again, our claim then remains that he has both a human and divine will to go along with his human and divine nature without any kind of mingling or confusion. Does that make sense? Yes.
So does human will just mean those natural kind of human instincts that everybody has?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Our wants and desires, whether that's a innate thing or not. Yeah. Yes. All right. Moving on then. So after this was the Quinisext Council, which literally means fifth and sixth, or sometimes called the Council of Trilo, or some other things. The reason that I even bring this up is because though it was not itself considered an ecumenical council, what it does is it takes what happened in the fifth and the sixth council and publishes a nice little set of canons, because the other councils all outputted a thing. They all got together, they did a thing, they decided a bunch of stuff, and then together wrote some things that they all agreed on and distributed. The fifth and sixth did not do that. They got together and they decided a bunch of things, but then they didn't make anything to distribute. And so the Quinisext Council was where that was solidified, where they wrote some things down to be distributed. They also took some local canons from smaller councils that were good and added them to the list. So because it did not on its own right determine any matters of doctrine, it's not considered one of the ecumenical councils and is effectively just considered part of the sixth council, but you'll notice from the dates that it was a little bit later, and it is considered in some ways also a little bit separate. So just so you know, if you're looking up a list of councils, you will find that one mentioned. All right, and then the last is the Seventh Ecumenical Council. The most iconic thing this did was the restoration of the icons in our churches, which obviously you can see adorn our walls. And at least ended the first round of iconoclasm. Out of several different reasons, but at least in my own opinion, I think one of the largest factors behind the rise of iconoclasm was purely political, i.e. by about this time, Islam starts to become somewhat of a thorn in the side of Constantinople, and they start losing lands. And so it seems like maybe there's somewhat of a thought that maybe, because Islam has a very big problem with icons, that if we can do away with icons, maybe they'll be more okay with us. Obviously that didn't work, not least of which because icons are very important and people did not want to get rid of them. Iconoclasm is not as monolithic as I think we sometimes think of it today. There were many schools of thought for exactly how to get rid of them. So the most destructive was effectively white walling churches. So you can still see in some churches in Greece where the frescoes on the wall were chipped such that there was now a rough surface for plaster to be put over them. But that was not the case everywhere. In other places, there was discussion about, well, maybe we can just put the icons up high so that we can honor them as instructional, but not actually venerate them in any way, shape, or form. Because if you may recall from our talking about this previously, icons really serve two important purposes, and one of them is that they are catechetical. They teach. If you think of, for example, my own small children that aren't exactly going to be reading the gospel or the epistles on their own and are probably going to struggle to listen to me read them, but they can look at the pictures and get at least something out of that. Or similarly, if you ever travel abroad and you go to a service in a language you do not understand, you may be able to kind of generally follow the shape of the service, but what feast are they celebrating that day? Well, the one whose icon is in the middle that you can see. Whether or not you can read the text on it, they're generally rather iconic, so you can probably figure out just by looking at what's being celebrated that day. So in some places anyway, there was a thought that, well, maybe we can just have the educational ones up high. Ultimately speaking, whether there was some middle ground or a desire to white wall entirely, icons were restored in the end both as educational tools and as objects worthy of veneration, but not worship. And so this is the council where we get this distinction between worship and veneration, which prior to that was not well defined. But understanding that worship is due to God alone, and veneration, or showing respect, is something we can do to anyone. And therefore, the saints who are depicted in the icons are being shown that honor when we venerate an icon. And there's a very classic line that comes out of it, which is that we are not worshiping the wood and the paint of the icon, but that the veneration passes on to the prototype, meaning that it isn't so much that it is a print on paper or an icon on wood that matters. It's what is being depicted. It's the person. Because ultimately we're all called to be icons of Christ. And so whether that's this flesh that's the icon or whether it's a painting that's the icon, either way, it is an icon of Christ. Yes?
Two sides to this question, but the first one with the rules and the regulations of icon venerations. As far as I understand it, a lot of South American syncretism effectively is what we see in a lot of the churches, like the Pachamama and Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Okay.
And that kind of almost worship, is that kind of in a line of, are they worshiping what is basically an icon of some kind of Catholic flavor? Or is it similar to the Orthodox approach of well, we just really, really love these things, and so we want to show them due respect?
I'm not sure that I can definitively answer what other groups feel when they either venerate or worship.
That's fair.
But what I can say is that, just in case this is an element of what you said, we've been talking about icons, but the word at the time was not really exclusive to this. When they talk about images, that would have been flat painted things, that would have been relief carved things, and that would have been an actual dimensional statue. Statuary has been a part of the church for basically ever. There are, though it is not popular today in the Orthodox world, there are museums throughout Greece and Russia that have old statuary from both traditions that at one point in time would have been very common. I think in the modern world, as we have kind of come back in contact with the Western world, which uses statuary, it has become somewhat of a demarcation between the two. Whereas before it was well, we don't prefer that, but it's used sometimes. We've kind of turned hard the other way and been like, no, we don't use statuary. But technically speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. I've seen Orthodox churches here in America that have statues in them. So the fact that it is a statue does not really change anything.
I see. And the other side of that question is this goes to the Protestants, which confused me a little bit on this one. Presbyterians are effectively iconoclasts, as far as I understand their approach to any kind of image of holy God or anything like that.
Okay.
But the Anglicans do still venerate saints and stuff like that, but they're still in communion with each other. As far as I understand, the Orthodox seems to be a little bit more united in what their larger approach is, but are there any things like that within the Orthodox Church where it's like, these people are obviously something that, they believe something very different about these very important facets of the church?
No.
Okay.
No, the Orthodox Church is very united in our understanding of belief because of these ecumenical councils. For a church to reject the Seventh Ecumenical Council and say, actually, no, icons are not okay, is to break communion with the church.
Okay.
So I mentioned before those that rejected the Fourth Ecumenical Council or the Third Ecumenical Council.
Yeah.
They are not part of the church, though they use the word Orthodox. So you may run into a Coptic Orthodox Church or an Ethiopian Orthodox Church or a Malankara Orthodox Church. They use the word, but they are not part of our communion. We do not can celebrate services together. We don't, you're welcome to go to their food festivals, I suppose, but you're not going to find us doing services together. I'm not going to ever tell people here to go over and receive communion at their liturgy.
So it's not like the Protestants where they have all their varying flavors of
right.
rules, regulations, and soteriology.
Which is part of why, I guess, maybe something that's more pertinent to your background within the Western rite of the Orthodox world. That is part of why it is not strictly accurate to say that it is just the Western practice done by itself. But you are very likely to see iconography in a Western Rite parish that would be uncommon, probably very uncommon, to see in a non-Orthodox Western parish. Because there's an understanding that the rite of liturgy doesn't really matter, right? Whether or not you say the prayers from this saint or this saint isn't really that big of a deal. The actual, like the rules for when and how you fast on any given day isn't really important as long as you're fasting. But on matters of faith, we have to be completely united.
Nice.
So whether you are a Western Rite parish, whether you're an Eastern Rite parish, whether you are a Ukrainian, Russian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Romanian, Georgian, Albanian, American, somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Mexico, it doesn't really matter. If you're in an Orthodox church, it's the same understanding of Christ. For us, that is ultimately what makes us be in communion, is that we share an understanding of Christ. And part of this veneration of icons is to say that because Christ put on flesh, we can depict that flesh, right? So even if we want to take a step away from icons of saints, we can make icons of Christ because he became something that we can depict, which is why, for example, we continue to hold that it is not appropriate to have iconography of God the Father, although you do sometimes see it, but it's not good. What you will see, and the correct iconographic way to depict the Father, is just a hand coming in from the side. So one of the most common iconographic depictions of the Trinity in the Feast of Theophany is Christ as the second person of the Trinity in the waters, a dove descending above him for the Spirit, and a hand coming in from the side. Because remember, it says in the Gospel that there was a voice booming, but it's hard to paint a voice in an icon. So we just have a little hand coming in from the side. But we don't do more than that. I did just a minute ago say there are a few examples you can find. Those come out of a particular time in Russian history where they decided that they wanted to be more Western, and so Catherine, the questionably great imported Venetian composers and iconographers and stuff like that, and did all sorts of weird stuff, and unfortunately some of it has survived. But even in those places where such icons exist, most people think it's weird and don't like it. So
More like a keep it for the history rather than the.
more like it's expensive to change. Yeah. Yes. Questions about any of that? Yes.
Can you explain the whole anathema thing, what that is?
Sure. That might be something I talk about here later, but regardless, so anathema is an understanding that something is incorrect. So we anathematize teachings. We excommunicate people. We do not anathematize people. So Arius was excommunicated. His teachings were anathematized. Meaning, had he decided to repent, his teachings would still have been anathema, but he would have been allowed to come back into the faith. Unfortunately, as you see, looking at the First Ecumenical Council, he did not, and continued to persist in his understanding, despite the entire assembled church telling him he was wrong. And so he remains excommunicated and not part of the church, which is why we call him the arch-heretic. A heretic, then, is one whose teachings have been anathematized. A heretic is not someone who believes incorrect teaching. Does that distinction make sense?
So then when they say, like, so-and-so is incorrect, whoever believes such, let them be anathema, that distinction would then be not them literally being anathematized themselves, but what they believe in being anathematized.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because the church has always had the understanding, well, I shouldn't say that. It was one of the things one of these councils talked about, but the ultimate decision was that you can always repent and come back. Whether or not you go way off the deep end or not doesn't really matter as long as you repent in the end, which is why we have stories like St. Moses the Black, who's very popular these days, who was very iconically a thief and robber and murderer, and yet is remembered as a saint. Whereas individuals that go the other way, we don't remember. So there are several individuals through history who started out writing quite a bit and then eventually fall away from the church, and we condemn their writings and don't care about what they have to say because it led them down a bad path, and we don't want anyone else to follow that bad path. But yes, generally speaking, a heretic is one who is teaching false doctrine, not one who believes, but one who teaches. The teachings are anathematized and the individual is excommunicated until they repent. Right. It is a good question, specifically because there's, I think, in the modern media representation of Christian, sometimes this idea of the heavy weight of anathema or excommunication. But the church's understanding has always been that excommunication really is something done by the individual themselves and only recognized by the church. So by being a heretic and teaching false doctrine and persisting when a council has said that you're wrong, you have excommunicated yourself by teaching something other than what the church says, right? So the church can acknowledge that and say, hey, until you repent, like, buddy, this isn't okay. But ultimately speaking, because it is on you to excommunicate yourself, it's also on you to come back and re-communicate yourself. And how do we do that? Confession, yeah.
I guess like the easier way to maybe like anathema with the belief part is because you're believing something that sets you outside of the church, kind of like we were talking about, is individual things. So it's not just like, oh, I did something like that, but it's like your belief leads you to do that thing that leads you outside of the body that everybody else is doing.
Yeah. Yep, if a teaching is against what the body of the church says, then you are sort of by definition outside of the communion of the church. All right. How are we doing for time?
7:20.
Okay. Well, I'll get through the last of this pretty quickly. So the ecumenical councils are larger versions of local councils, which I mentioned a little bit in the Quinisex Council. These continue to happen. Sometimes people claim that, we can't do an ecumenical council because the Roman Church left. An ecumenical council would be all of the churches currently in communion with one another. So after some people left in the council, after the third ecumenical or fourth ecumenical council, we didn't say, well, that's it, just because some people left. So we absolutely could. The reason we haven't is because we haven't needed to. I hope you can gather from what I have just described about these 7 ecumenical councils is that in the end, they all focus very specifically on Christ, and therefore our interaction with him and his saving work that we either can or cannot participate in depending on our belief. We haven't had anything else like that come up, so we haven't had a need to have another ecumenical council. Although there has been some talk more recently in doing another ecumenical council, and attempts have not gone well, but we do continue to do councils regularly. We do them every year on the parish level. We do them every year on the diocesan level. We do it every 3 years as an OCA, as this local synod here in North America, and then as necessary on scales beyond that. It's also not uncommon to have councils that contain some selection of the church. These, 3 churches get together and have a council amongst themselves to discuss things that are affecting their lands, but maybe don't affect other people. And so it's not really a need for it to be ecumenical because it's not an everywhere thing, but within those lands, it's necessary for those people to talk to each other. So we continue to meet, we continue to talk, we continue to decide important things about the church and governance thereof and our faith and all that good stuff in the modern world. We just haven't really needed to do anything quite as grand as these 7. Although I will say there are several councils which we kind of effectively treat as ecumenical, even though we don't number them among these because they had some good and important things which we all agree by de facto are good, even though we don't number them among these. I can't really give you a strict reason for why some and not the other. I think one of the biggest reasons is that, again, these first 7 were very focused specifically on Christ and on our relationship with him. And the subsequent ones may be universal in their applicability, but were not so strictly focused on Christ. We've already talked about a lot of this. But I guess maybe just to reiterate a little bit, Christ is the foundation of our theology for saints and icons. We can have icons because Christ became man and took on flesh, something that I can see in all of you and therefore can depict in all of you. Why would it be different with Christ? He put on human flesh, I can depict that human flesh. Well, I wouldn't be a good choice for that, but some people can. And so when we are showing honor, I think one of the things that I often describe to people who struggle with this a little bit is, in a very modern sense, imagine going to a somewhat non-religious funeral for someone where, unfortunately, it needs to be a closed casket funeral. Would you be weirded out? Would you be offended? Would you be confused if the mother, if the wife or husband, if the child, whatever, of the departed kisses a picture of the individual who's recently departed? I don't think any of us would give it a second thought, right? They're showing their love for this person that they've now lost, right? That is literally what we're doing. It is the exact same thing. We just don't use photographs, we paint. But it is the exact same thing. We don't understand these icons to be the people they depict. Neither does a person in the funeral think that they are actually kissing their departed person. Everyone understands it's a picture. And yet we also feel a stronger connection through the image. And when we kiss the image, we understand that it's because we love, because we honor the person depicted in it, not the wood and the paint. Just like we honor Christ, And those that, came up and, as it's described, sometimes were kissing his feet. It's not because they really liked human feet, right? They understood that this was God, that they were worshiping God through the humanity. And so we understand that we are venerating, in effect, we are worshiping God through our veneration of the saints. The saints are those that did a good job in their lifetime of getting themselves out of the way so that God can work through them. They are icons of Christ, and we honor that. Another interesting point, the use of iconography predates Christianity. The style that we use was common in Rome, but as we talked about in one of our previous sessions, there was imagery, there was iconography in the Jewish temple. It's explicitly called for to be on the Ark of the Covenant, right? So there's an understanding of imagery used in worship. It is not a uniquely Christian thing. It's not a uniquely Orthodox thing. Skipping ahead a little bit here. We've talked about a lot of this, so I'm not going to say it again. Another thing to note is that we don't just adorn our churches with icons. I hope if you are coming into the church and you're trying to take this seriously, I hope you will make a little home altar for yourself and put iconography up there. Christ and the Theotokos are common. If you have selected someone to be your patron saint, put them up. Anyone else you feel connected to, maybe some of the North American saints or someone else whose story you really connect with. You'll see people put icons in their cars. You'll see people, there's not a lot of people in the U.S. that do this, but it's not uncommon for people to bring icons into their work. Pin up on a little board in their desk or something like that. People put these icons all over the place because we understand that they help us focus on God. They bring us back to churchly things, even when we're out in the world doing other things.
Question about
Yes.
iconography. Is there any restriction on the style and form of an icon? Like, because I know there's some Catholic ones that I see that are a little bit more avant-garde.
So iconography's job is to depict the person. Cubism does not do a good job of depicting a person.
Yeah.
It is an interesting thing to look at, certainly, and we have no problem with art for the sake of art, but that is not, you will not universally be able to look at that and go, yes, I know who that is, right? Especially for some of the newer saints, like, for example, St. John of San Francisco. You can find pictures that were taken of him and compare to his icon, and you'll see that they look very similar, because it's, the same person, done in the style that matches, the iconography that we see, but still very much him. You're not going to look at an icon as someone who knew him in real life and not be able to tell that is very definitely the same person. So yes, in a sense, icons must be clearly identifiable as the person they're supposed to be. Similarly speaking, it is very common, there's sort of a de facto standard that certain saints are depicted certain ways, either because that's how they looked, or because, for example, we depict balding is supposed to be like a sign of wisdom in Greek culture, and so it's pretty common to see some of the apostles depicted as being balding. And that's very, very common. Yes?
About the apostles,
sorry.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question then? So they can look different, right? I mean, every artist has their own style. And so they're never going to be truly identical. There's always going to be a personal touch of this iconographer or that iconographer. And there's also broader strokes, like Russian iconography looks different than Greek iconography. That's okay, right? They don't have to be identical. But if you look at a Greek icon of this person and a Russian icon of this person, you're going to be able to tell they're the same person. even if elements of the icon are
That's the
different.
important part. Is that you can obviously tell this is who it is,
Yeah.
and every single version of it will look more or less like that.
Yeah, I mean, another great example, like the three hierarchs. If you look at ancient iconography of them, like, barely visible in the degrading wall kind of iconography, you'll see that iconic beard that he was talking about earlier on all of them, right? Even if you can't see the name, you can pretty much always look at the face and tell that's who that is.
Weren't the apostles like, or at least I've heard online, like the apostles were like actually younger teenagers, but in all the iconography they were depicted as like older people.
John was young.
Mm-hmm.
He was definitely quite young,
Mm-hmm.
and he's depicted as being young most of the time. But no, they definitely were not all. Remember that marriage, well, maybe this is remember. Remember that marriage in the Jewish culture at the time was pushed way down the line.
Mm-hmm.
You had to be financially stable, which I think traditionally at the time meant around the age of 30. So several of them were married, so they
I thought
definitely
it was,
weren't teens.
I thought it was because the normal thing that people point out is the temple tax that Jesus told Peter to pay the temple tax for Jesus and Peter, but not the rest of the apostles. And it was like the age of like, okay, if you're this age, you pay the temple tax. And then Peter was married. I didn't know that the other apostles were married. I didn't know that.
It was not a band of teenagers with Peter. Some of them were certainly younger, yes. I mean, a good example, you look at the icon of the Christ praying in Gethsemane right there. You can see some of them are depicted as older and some are depicted as younger. And John is the one depicted without a beard, so young that he can't grow a beard.
I think St. Cleopas is older in that one too.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I mean, sometimes, so certainly when we are depicting these kinds of images that we have at the top, which are images from the gospel, we're going to depict what is accurate for that moment in time. But an icon of Saints Peter and Paul is definitely going to show both of them being older, because they didn't do their churchly things until older. And certainly, for example, Saint Seraphim right above your head there, we depict as older because that's how he looked when he died, right? So we're going to tend to depict people the way they looked closer to their death because that's how people actually remember them looking, and that's the point of the icon, is to remember the person. So it's going to look the way we remember them looking.
Yeah, St. Peter and St. Paul, you can find really, really old icons of them, but they look similar through all the ages. I think maybe at the earliest ones. So far we haven't covered, I think it's maybe 2nd century, but like St. Paul has like a distinctive balding one, and St. Peter has a distinct face. But then I would always imagine that those original iconographers would have probably drew a picture of them like as in the moment they met him, which would have been later in their life. So
Yeah. St.
Peter would have been an older fellow when he was martyred, and St. Paul, well, yeah, when you get beat up a lot on the road, you probably look a little older too. But yeah, you're not going to draw a 20-year-old St. Paul when you didn't know what he looked like.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, just to draw one of the things you said, which is the remarkable similarity is true, not just for Peter and Paul. I mean, pretty much all of the icons, you look at very ancient historical examples and very modern ones, and you'll find they look very similar. So.
Makes sense.
Yeah, remember you saying there. So also important that they're not portraits per se too.
Yes, to be clear, yeah, we don't want them to be photographs because we don't want to completely remember the fallen nature of them. We are remembering them as those that have been glorified, and so there is a sort of heavenly quality that we give to them, but we certainly acknowledge them the way they were as well. So.
Case in point, St. John was not walking around with his head at the time.
Yes.
With wings.
Yeah.
I actually did have a question about that icon too. So,
Okay.
So okay, I guess this relates like the Theos is like becoming like God coming even to the angels. Is that why St. John has wings?
He lived the angelic life, yes.
Okay. Because I was very confused. I was like, oh, St. John was an angel, so why does he have wings? It's like,
That leads me into a question as well.
We're, I will really quickly butt in before, so hold on to that for a second. We are called to be more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, just like the Theotokos. So we are not called to be equal, we are called to be above the angels, but we fall and fail to do that quite a bit. But we are given the image and likeness of God, which the angels are not.
Okay, that kind of answers and leads me back to the same question. Pictures and icons of like the archangels.
Mm-hmm.
How exactly? I mean, I guess what they would pick as just a phenotypically normal face that they would put onto the angel.
Yes.
But then depicting them, there's no issue with that because we are then technically above them, or would they be?
So we depict some angels.
Yeah.
Um,
Mostly, I think Michael, right?
Well, we've got two up there, right? Michael and Gabriel are common. Gabriel in the Annunciation is always depicted, right? So those that interact with humans, we depict as they show themselves to be. And then we have descriptions of the cherubim and the seraphim, one with 6 wings, the other with 6, with 2 they cover their face, with 2 they cover their feet, with 2 they fly. So you'll see that depiction sometimes. Sometimes you'll see images of the wheel with wings around, as described in Isaiah. Yeah, I wanted to say Elijah, but that didn't feel right.
Ezekiel, too.
One of those. Anyway, so we have several depictions of angels, but as humans, we only depict the archangels as messengers.
I'm also confused on how many archangels there are. I know the Michael and Gabriel absolutely for sure, 100%. The rest of them, though, I hear like just through pop culture sometimes, other times like the missions.
There are a few more, I believe, names. So if you look at there's a feast for the there's a feast for the angelic host, and it names the ones we have the names for. There are a few others that have been accepted into pop culture that are not historical at all. So you may be thinking of some of those, but ultimately speaking, I don't think we've really been given to know exactly how many of any rank of angel there are. For example, it says in some cases that there's angels assigned to every country. There's angels assigned to every chrismation, baptism, being brought into the church. Everyone is given a guardian angel. So many, quite a few. Yes.
Why are there? Why is probably the right word. Like the kind of ranks of angels and saints. How does that work? Like, how does like the church determine like, oh, like the saints?
We don't really have ranks of saints
Okay.
per se. Their feasts have ranks, but that has much more to do with how much we care about that particular person, which means that it can change from one country to another. A very good example of this is St. Patrick is someone that Russia never cared about, and so he wasn't even on their calendar. In modern times he is, but they don't really do anything for him. Whereas the Orthodox Church in Ireland, what's the guy's name? He's on YouTube, you can find stuff. I'm quite certain he treats that as a vigil rank feast, because he's in Ireland. Hard not to. There are a few churches here in the U.S. named after him, so I'm sure they treat that as a vigil rank feast as well. So the amount we celebrate a saint has much more to do with how much we know and care about them. North American saints are another good example. Here in North America, we treat pretty much all of them as vigil rank feasts, very high-ranking feasts. Elsewhere in the world, if they're commemorated, probably nothing more than a daily saint like many of the other ones here. So the rank of a feast is really independent from the rank of a saint, because we don't have ranks for saints, really. Except, I suppose, for ecclesiastical rank, but that doesn't really mean anything because plenty of bishops can be bad too. So it doesn't imply that you were better just because you were given a particular rank, hierarchical rank. Angels do certainly have ranks. If you want to break your head a little bit, go read St. Dionysius's the angelic host. What is it called now? I'm blanking on the actual title of it. St. Dionysius has a whole. It's not that long. Text on
or divine.
Angelic hierarchy, divine, yeah, something like that. I should remember. Forgive me for not in the moment, but and he talks about the ranks of angels and why. But the general thing he talks about is that you have the thrones and dominions and powers that basically attend to God. The thrones are literally who he sits on, so they're the physically closest. You have everyone down to, angels and archangels that are sent out, that go into the world and do things as messengers and protectors and whatnot. So there is a physical closeness to God in their inherent to their hierarchy. But we are a hierarchical church. We certainly have an understanding that there is a need, that hierarchy is good, at least when it's not abused. But certainly within the angelic hierarchy, it is understood to not be abused. So it is a good thing.
It's called St. Dionysius' celestial hierarchy.
Celestial hierarchy,
Yeah.
That's the word. Yep. So, yeah, and it's not short, but it's not crazy long either.
But it's also very dense.
You may have to reread it a few times, but yeah.
And it's free. You can find out online for free too, probably.
Yeah, a lot of those older writings you can find online. All right. I'm sure we're at time now. Oh, a little bit after. Okay. Anything else? Otherwise, I will see you all either this weekend or next week at some point. Wonderful. Yes. Yeah. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'll get Lori to stop blowing up the chat with emojis. You can read a couple of them.
Everything on the left is previous week's. Everything on the right is current or